Well, the Lord Jesus, in one of his prophecies, was going to use this literal event in prophetic terms. So when we're looking at the account of Noah, really we're looking at this literal event, but it's going to be played out in the story of Bible prophecy. So with that in mind, I'd like us to jump right in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 2, because I'd like us to think, well, what I want to address in this session is what was the perspective of Yeshua when he uttered the profound and eerie, ominous phrase, as in the days of Noah. What was the perspective of Jesus? So if we come to Genesis chapter 6 and we look at verse 2, and we're met immediately, aren't we, with havoc. Because it says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. So we've got a mingling here between two groups. The one group is known as the sons of God. And when you see that phrase, the sons of God, it is almost always applied to the nation of Israel. After all, the sons of God were Israel, weren't they? God even said, I am your father and you are my sons. They were the firstborn son of God, was Israel. Now, the second group we see here in Genesis 6 verse 2 is the daughters of men. And brothers and sisters, you all know more than most that when we see the phrase, the daughters of men, it is speaking of those who are in opposition to God's people, that being Israel. It's speaking prophetically, brothers and sisters, of the heathen nations who are not bound into the covenant of Abraham. And so we've got a merging and a mingling between two groups. The one group is the offspring of Adam, the daughters of men, and the other offspring is the sons of God. And I think, brothers and sisters and friends, we have a prophetic warning right here in Genesis 6, because what's happening here, God is establishing prophetic principles. Later in the law of Moses, Yahweh was going to address the issue he saw in Genesis 6 verse 2, wasn't he? Because it was forbidden in Exodus 34 verse 16 for the sons of God to marry the daughters of men, lest they fall into idolatry, was the commandment. And we know Israel, they failed dramatically, didn't they? Just like we're seeing here in Genesis chapter 6, because this is a prophecy that's going to be played out again. The question is, brothers and sisters, what was it that brought the flood upon the earth? Well, dare I say, it was the mingling here between these two parties, the merging between the seed of man and the seed of God. So the other question is, whose fault was it? Who really brought the flood upon the earth at that time? May I suggest, it was the sons of God. It was their fault. And through their actions, that's what brought the flood upon the earth. Well, if you look at Genesis 6 verse 3, man's days, it says, will be 120 years. And you know the phrase, God's spirit will not strive with man for 120 years. That's really specific, isn't it? 120. And that might strike a chord with you, because there was another man who had a limitation of 120 years, an iconic, profound, poignant brother. And that man was Moses. Moses lived up to 120 years. This verse you see here in verse 3 just happens to be the lifespan of Moses. And well, Moses was synonymous with the law, wasn't he? In fact, you could say Moses represented the law. And because he represented the law, he was not allowed to go into the promised land because of his span of life, which was 120 years. And isn't it marvelous, brothers and sisters, that when you come to the 120th year of Moses, there was a crossing over the waters in which Moses was forbidden to enter because he was synonymous with the law. And then it says in verse 3, my spirit shall not always strive with man. And you'll notice that phrase, my spirit. This is such a common such a common term. You'll see it often in the prophets, my spirit. In fact, that very phrase is used for the prophets. We know that Yahweh gave the prophets his spirit and they proclaimed God's message on behalf of the Father. And so the spirit here is his spirit word that was later to be used with the prophets. And well, you only have to turn to Acts chapter 7, brothers and sisters and friends, and you'll see Stephen. And he stands up in Jerusalem before all of the people. And mark the words he says. He says, you have uncircumcised ears. You have always resisted the Spirit, he says, just as your fathers. That was the Apostle Stephen. That they had resisted the Spirit of God. That was proclaimed through the prophets. That there was a mingling between the seeds. And you only have to go to the book of Ezra. And Ezra breaks his heart for the mingling of the seed, didn't he? So poor was it that he couldn't even recognize the language anymore. Because it all began in this story, this ancient literal event that was to prove to be a future prophecy. So these are the factors, I think, in a way, that brought the flood upon the earth to destroy them. But rather, it doesn't say that, does it? Because if you look at verse 1 of chapter 6 and verse 7 of chapter 6, it doesn't say, I will destroy them from the earth. It actually says the phrase, I will destroy them from the face of the earth. That's rather different, isn't it? There's a difference between from the earth and from the face of the earth. And if you were to look at that phrase, the face of the earth, you'll notice as you see it through the scriptures being used, it is a prophetic term unique to Israel. I mean, we only have to go to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 15. And Yahweh says, if you do not obey me, if you do not heed to my voice, I will wipe you off, notice the phrase, the face of the earth. In fact, if you were to look at Matthew 23 and verse 35, Matthew, through the words of Jesus, describes the face of earth belonging to Judah itself, the face of it. And this is why, when we come to Bible prophecy, we have two terrains. We have those of the earth that speak of Israel, and we have those of the seas that speak of the nations. That was rather weak, wasn't it? The nations. And there's a contrast between the two. Those of Israel, which are of the earth, and those of the Gentiles, which are of the seas. It's all brought here in Genesis chapter 6. It's starting to see the establishment of how the divine word is going to be used through the scriptures. If you look at verse 7 of Genesis chapter 6, Yahweh said, I will destroy man whom I have created. And I guess what, brothers and sisters? Guess who created Israel? Yahweh even says it in Isaiah chapter 43. I have created you. They were formed from the hand of God. In Isaiah chapter 43. But it goes on. And Yahweh said, I will destroy man whom I have created. And then he says, both man and beast and creeping thing and fowls of the air. Now that phrase, man, beast, and creeping thing, fowls of the air, you only have to look again into the prophecies towards the end, particularly in the minor prophets. That is a phrase that's often used to apply to the complete destruction of Judah. I mean, Zephaniah even uses the same phrase in Zephaniah chapter 1 and verse 1 to 4. When the Babylonian horde was just about to seize Jerusalem, Zephaniah, through the might of God, says, I will destroy both man, both beast, both fowl. It's the same words here in Genesis chapter 6 and verse 7. And in the middle of all of this, at the center of this immoral tempest, verse 8, one man found grace whose name was Rest. Noah. Noah found grace. In fact, the word grace there you see in Genesis 6 verse 8 just happens to be the first time grace is ever used in the Bible. And Noah was distinct from the rest because he was a man of grace. And when we think about the Lord Jesus Christ, grace is going to be the very term that's used to describe him separate from the law. The law was given to Moses in his 120-year span, but grace came by Yeshua, says John. It's the very word that's used to separate him from the law. And not only that, brothers and sisters, but you only have to look at verse 18, that through Noah, God was going to establish his covenant. So not only was this man a man of rest, not only was this man a man of grace, but Yahweh was going to establish his divine covenant with Noah. And if you look at Genesis 7 verse 1, specifically, it tells us there that Noah was righteous in, and note the phrase, he was righteous in this generation. Now that phrase, this generation here in Genesis 7 verse 1, is a prophetic phrase that's used by Jesus. And so when we come to Jesus, who indeed was the confirmer of the covenant, who was indeed a man of rest, who found grace, who was perfect in his generation, who was righteous in that generation, which incidentally is the notorious 42nd generation that Matthew 23 describes as being the generation of serpents. Well, we're seeing here a man played out in its full type in Jesus, in the Gospels. And, well, Jesus too gave a warning, didn't he? He gave a profound warning. And I'll read the words taken from Luke 21, verse 32. Mark the words Jesus says. And he's speaking directly now to Jerusalem. Luke 21, verse 32. This generation shall not pass. Well, I believe, brothers and sisters, those are the words taken from Genesis 7, verse 1. This generation. And then you go further into the Olivet prophecy, and then in verse 35, he then says, destruction shall come upon those that dwell upon the face of the earth. Well, that's a phrase taken directly from Genesis 6, verse 7, the face of the earth. And I find it highly, divinely ironic that Jesus began his entire ministry in Capernaum in Galilee. Galilee. Of all the places, that's where Yeshua chose to start his mission. 2 Kings 15 verse 29 tells us that Galilee was an area where the northern Jews were scattered by the Assyrians. In other words, Jesus chose specifically to go to Galilee because it was the place of the scattered Jews across the Gentile seas. Hence the phrase, Galilee of the Gentiles. We have a man who's starting the covenant of Yahweh, a man of rest, a man perfect in his generations, who found grace, who's working a way of salvation, who demands the allegiance of Jerusalem. At the very same time, he starts off in the scattered seas of the Gentiles called Galilee. I find it highly ironic, brothers and sisters, that he begins at the sea that belongs to the Jews in a place called the Gentiles. And he starts off, doesn't he? His headquarters is in Capernaum. Capernaum, the village of comfort, it means. What a reassuring place for a Messiah to start. The place of comfort. And yet we're told in Genesis chapter 5 and verse 29 that they called him Noah, for he shall comfort us. And here begins Yeshua on the seas of the Gentiles, the place of the scattered Jews. Noah, the man of comfort. This was the place in Matthew 11, verse 28, where Jesus in Capernaum was going to say, come unto me, come unto me. Well, I believe those are the same words spoken to Noah in Genesis 7, verse 1. Come unto me, and I will give you rest, or I will give you Noah. At Capernaum, the place of comfort. There was the man of rest, distinct from his generations, a man of grace in the worst generation in Jewish history. And it's in Galilee, brothers and sisters, in Matthew chapter 4, of course, where Jesus was to choose his disciples, in which he would say to them and utter the very famous phrase, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." You know, you come to think about it, a large amount of his sermons, miracles and parables are all done via ship on a sea, at the place of the scattered Jews, the place known as the Sea of the Gentiles. And if you come to think about it, most of Jesus' ministry in those 3.5 years is always to do with seas and waters and floods. You know, it's almost as if he's preparing them for something. You know, whether it's in Matthew chapter 17, the father who had a sick son and feared his son being thrown into the sea, or maybe it's in Luke chapter 8, the wild man who begged Jesus not to throw him into the abyss, or maybe in John chapter 5, the impotent man who rose next to the waters, or maybe his parables foretold future seas and waters. We remember this one, our children sing it. The floods came up and the waters came down. What do you think he's preparing them for, brothers and sisters, as we mark the start of his mission in the sea of the scattered Jews at the place of the Gentiles, a man of rest who's going to establish the covenant, a man who found grace, and a man who gave a stark warning to the inhabitants of Jerusalem that just so happens to echo the very same sentiments that we found in Genesis chapter 6. It was over, brothers and sisters. And I find it even more ironic that Jesus began his mission on the Sea of the Gentiles, only then to find himself in the heart of Jerusalem, giving a prophecy about the Sea of the Gentiles. Let's go to Luke chapter 21, please. Luke chapter 21 and verse 24. Jerusalem shall be led away captive unto the nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. You know, here Jesus is picking up on a previous prophecy. This is the Olivet prophecy, and he's speaking about the future destruction. But these aren't the first words spoken of it. He's picking up upon a famous prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, the 70-week prophecy. And in that prophecy, Daniel saw a vision of the destruction of Jerusalem. And he broke his heart, brothers and sisters, at what he saw. But there was a specific word that Daniel saw. And he knew that Rome would come and take Jerusalem and ransack the city. But there's one word, brothers and sisters, that describes how Rome would come in Daniel chapter 9. It's the word flood. Rome was to come in like a flood upon Jerusalem. And here is Jesus, a few hundred years later, picking up on the same narrative. He's continuing the story of Daniel 9. And now Jesus is bringing ahead in Luke 21, verse 24, that Rome would come, and AD 70 did happen. And in 40 years from these sentiments, well, Jews were scattered across the Gentile seas. And such was their scattering that they ended up a little bit like Galilee, didn't they? A circuit of Jews across the seas. Not on a national scale, but on an international scale. You know, when we think about Peter, 2 Peter 3 verse 3-7, Peter even describes the destruction of Jerusalem as he compares it to the flood. Peter says, Jerusalem shall be destroyed just like the flood. That's 2 Peter 3 verse 3-7. And the Spirit word is even giving us the analogy and the simile of the flood. And AD 70 began with a flood, brothers and sisters. It began with the flood of Rome from Daniel 9. But over time, those flood waters are going to become, verse 25 in Luke 21. They're going to become the seas of nations with perplexity. The seas and the waves are roaring. And what began in AD 70, the nations now are going to become politically perplexed, this is the current time. This is a 2,000-year span from AD 70. The seas and the nations are roaring, but the seas, brothers and sisters, won't always be there. And that's the point. Yeshua is leading us to the future. If we were to go, and there's no need to turn there, because I've got it on the screen for us. But if you were to look at Genesis chapter 8, this is the moment that Noah came out of the ark and he saw the assuaging and the retreating of the waters. And Yahweh spoke to him. I mean, the man couldn't believe what had just happened. And well, Yahweh said to him, I will never destroy the world with the floods of the waters again. Now, remember, this is a prophecy. It's using these natural events, these literal events, to proclaim spiritual ideas. And what's interesting is if you look at Genesis chapter 8 and verse 22, you'll notice, I love this, brothers and sisters, the margin is telling you. It's telling you where to go. It's saying, go to Isaiah 54. So what that's telling us that this literal event of Noah has a prophetic outcome with Israel. I'll have it on the screen for you, brothers and sisters, in Isaiah chapter 54. But what Isaiah 54 speaks about profoundly is the destruction of Jerusalem amongst the Gentile nations, the treading down of Jerusalem that Jesus is picking up on Luke 21, verse 25. And Isaiah 54 gives a name for these waters. He tells us the name of the Gentile waters, and you'll never have a guess what the name of the waters is in Isaiah 54, verse 9. He calls them the waters of Noah. And the waters of Noah are the Gentile nations that have been treading down upon Jerusalem for 2,000 years. There was another margin reference, wasn't there? Because Isaiah 54, as Yahweh speaks to that prophet, he's saying, remember what happened with Noah? I'm going to retreat those waters, brother. I'm going to retreat those waters, he says to Isaiah. They'll no longer fully destroy the earth again. Well, let's go to the other one. The other reference is Genesis 8, verse 22, just happens to be Jeremiah 33. And Jeremiah is about to see the Babylonian captivity take place. And in Jeremiah 33, he picks up upon the same words of Genesis chapter 8. Yahweh made a covenant with Noah, and he says, as long as there's day and night, you will never break my covenant. I will never fully destroy Israel with the waters of the Gentiles again. And if you, Jeremiah, can break the covenant of day and night, I will cast the seed of Jacob into the seas. Now, who here can break the covenant of day and night? No one. So that means the waters are going to retreat. The waters of the Gentiles will assuage. And well, that's been spoken about here in Jeremiah 33, verse 20 to 26. Just so happens to pick up on the narrative of, well, Genesis chapter 8, which just so happens to be the story of Isaiah 54, which is just the words of Daniel chapter 9 and the prophecy of the destruction that Jesus then takes further to Luke 21, verse 25. That just so happens to be the man who started as the man of rest, who established the covenant in the Sea of the Gentiles, which happens to be Galilee. That was about the scattered Jews. And I'll take a breath. The thing is, brothers and sisters, when we think about the phrase, as in the days of Noah, it's talking about an end-time prophecy for all generations that began in AD 70 at the marking of the flood of Rome. And we've been suffering the waters of Noah for 2,000 years. But the nations will no longer be there. God has promised through the covenant of day and night that he will retreat those waters. Deuteronomy 11, brothers and sisters, Yahweh says, I care for that land. The little land of Israel. I love it, says God. And he will retreat the waters. But for many of our brothers and sisters who go back to those first century ecclesias, the waters of the Noah, the waters of the Gentiles have been on the Jewish earth for a very long time. You know they killed Jesus for these words. You know that? Amongst other things, of course. Because he told them, this is going to be handed over to the Gentiles, as he warned them of a future flood. Remind me who else warned the people of a future flood in which they tried to kill him for it? A man called Enoch. Who do you think he typifies, brothers and sisters? Enoch prophesied of a future flood in the Epistle of Jude. You find out in his story they tried to kill him for it. He was translated, of course, and saved. We've got a man who's typing Jesus here in the story of Genesis chapter 5. Now, with the Mosaic era absolved, a new way of salvation is going to be ushered in. And that new way of salvation is going to be baptism. And how appropriate that 1 Peter 3 verse 21 likens the Ark of Noah to baptism. The end of Jerusalem is going to conclude with a flood, and the beginning of the story of Jesus is going to begin with an ark. And so when we see in Luke chapter 21 and in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is imploring them, come out of Jerusalem. The flood of Rome is coming, and come unto me, who are those who are weary and burdened, and I will give you Noah, rest. Come out of the city. It's over. It's done. It's finished. And how wonderful, brothers and sisters, when we think about baptism itself, of course, it's symbolic of burying Adam in death and rising out in Jesus. But in the very action of baptism, what we're doing is we're plunging ourselves in the acknowledgement that Jerusalem is covered by the seas of the earth. And when we come out of those waters, we recognize that Israel will be restored. And that is the hope of Israel. That is the hope that we share in the waters of baptism. And you know what, brothers and sisters? Jerusalem itself has been preparing for a rebirth. Did we know that Jerusalem has gone through a 2,000-year baptism? Because now we can see her in sight. 1948, Israel was established and the mountains were seen. 1967, Jerusalem was claimed. 2024, at the very time we speak together, the enemies of Israel are going to suffer from the hands of the people they hate. Israel are winning. Israel is seen. Jerusalem is there. And we're beginning to see the waters of the Gentiles retreat upon the nation God loves, the nation that we've bound ourselves in to the waters of baptism. And have a guess what? The focus of the entire Noahic narrative is about the retreating of those waters. We're nearly there, brothers and sisters. The ark is at rest. And the mountains are there. We've just got to hold into that ark. We've got to hold into the boat. You know, it's been the hope for centuries, hasn't it? Many of our brothers and sisters have hoped for the sign of Israel. And Revelation now, when we look at post-AD 70, Revelation is then going to give an exposition of the seas of the Gentiles. We're beyond AD 70 in the story of Revelation. And this is why we call it the continuous historic interpretation, because we begin in AD 70 at the start of the Roman flood, and we follow the story of the seas through the book of Revelation. And those seas, brothers and sisters, I don't know about you, but they're terrifying. And I'm rather seasick. That was a joke. But you'll notice out of these waters we see beasts rise out of them. Roman beasts, Islamic beasts, French Revolution frogs. They're all rising out of the abyss, says Revelation chapter 16 and verse 4. They're all coming out, and these waters are going to continue until the second coming of Jesus. And yet in this, brothers and sisters, rising above those seas is one ark containing fishers of men. And it's frightening and it's violent, and anyone who's raising young children like me will recognize the absolute devastating nature of what the world is showing us today, those Gentile seas. You know, we only have to go to Psalm 107, and in Psalm 107 we see sailors. And what we see, they're going across the waters. And of course, the waters here are symbolic of the nations. And those ships that work in the sea in Psalm 107, notice the violence and the commotion of those seas. And if you look at verse 25 and verse 29 of Psalm 107, the sailors notice that it is Yahweh who raises the storms, and it is Yahweh who calms the storms. And these sailors, as they sail upon those oceans of the nations, they begin to realize that the nations themselves are at the orchestration of Yahweh. He's the one who raises them. He's the one who calms them. And those sailors begin to realize this. And we begin to realize that the problems that we have in our life and the trials that we go through are simply the result of God's plan with the world. And we've got to be sailors, brothers and sisters. And we've got to ride those oceans together. And in verse 30 it says that he brings them unto their desired haven. Notice the phrase in green. He brings them unto their desired haven. You know, that's a direct allusion taken from Genesis 49. In Genesis 49 we see one of the blessings of Zebulun. Zebulun was told that he was going to be a safe haven for ships, which is then brought about in the ships of Psalm 107. And if you look at the map of where Zebulun was, there's got a big problem here, because Zebulun has no coastline. How can it be a safe haven for ships if it's landlocked? Where was Nazareth? Jesus grew up in the tribe of Zebulun. Jesus is the safe haven for the ship of the storm. Noah, rest. He's the one who's leading us to the land, the restoration of Israel. And there are a group of sailors who knew this more than most, that just so happened to be the very disciples who followed their Messiah upon those seas. Let us turn, brothers and sisters, to Matthew chapter 8. Jesus is described in Hebrews chapter 6 as being the anchor of our souls. Isn't that lovely? The anchor of our soul. And in Matthew chapter 8, we're going to see, well, these disciples are traveling by ship. And in its wider context, the disciples here are actually traveling over to the Gentiles. They're actually going to heal a man called Legion, who had a wildness about him. And these seas are representing that man. And you look at verse 24, there arose a great tempest in the sea. Now that word tempest that you see there is actually the word seismos. It's that, you know, brothers, this was a tsunami. You know, this was unbelievable. It was an earthquake that caused this great tempest. Now, if you were to look at that word seismos there in verse 4 of Matthew chapter 8, you'd be taken eventually to Revelation, in which earthquakes speak of political changes. So we're seeing a giant metaphor here spoken of in Matthew chapter 8. These ships are on the seas of the Gentiles, and they're seeing these huge political changes like earthquakes, and they're on the seas. You know, incidentally, the word fisherman you see there in Matthew chapter 8 has the same idea as the Hebrew. The word fisherman from the root means salted. Right? And they're known as being salted because they knew every gust of wind and every droplet of water on that ocean. They knew how to sail those seas, fishermen, but they'd never, ever seen anything like this. This was an earthquake that was beyond their understanding. And in Luke chapter 8, verse 26, have a guess what sea they're on, brothers and sisters? They're on the Sea of the Gentiles. This is Galilee. Galilee of the Gentiles, in which they're seeing political changes as earthquakes. In fact, if you were to look at Luke chapter 8 and verse 23, it tells us there specifically that they were in jeopardy. And incidentally, the word jeopardy is used in Acts chapter 19 as a word to describe a political riot. In Acts 19, it was the Gentiles who caused a political riot, and the apostle says we're in jeopardy. And so on this storm of the Gentiles, on the seas of the Gentiles, we've got Jewish sailors. They're seeing political changes, brothers and sisters. That's in the figure of a riot. And then it says in verse 25 that they feared they would perish. You know that word perish? It just so happens to be the same word used in 2 Peter 3 verse 6 to describe those who were perished by the flood. This is the surge of the Gentiles we see in the storm of Matthew chapter 8. And you'll notice that there is a ship sailing upon those seas. And if Peter is telling us that this word is used for the flood, well, the ark survived the flood, didn't it? Who do you think the ship of the disciples here represents? It's taking us back to Noah. The ship here is the ark. And who's the ark? The ark today is you and I. It's the ecclesia on the seas of the Gentiles in political changes. And the problem is, brothers and sisters, in Matthew chapter 8 and verse 24, Yeshua was asleep. And they've got a big problem here. And the problem is there's no hope in death. There was no hope for humanity in Jesus' death. They needed the resurrection. They needed a resurrection here. And if you look at verse 25, they awoke him. The word awoke there is the word agiro. And it's used, 28 times in 1 Corinthians 15. This was a resurrection. They saw a resurrection because there was a man deep in sleep in the middle of a storm, and then they woke him up. And now Jesus is awake, brothers and sisters. Now that he's awake, he will deal with the storm. He's going to deal with it because they needed him awake. And I find this unbelievable. I really do. I'm going to be honest with you. You're in this big tempest, huge waves billowing over. You're seamen. You've never seen anything like this. And then in verse 26, Jesus turns to them in the middle of the storm. Why are you so fearful of little faith? Are you kidding me? Anyone would fear this. The point being, I think, that Jesus has risen. He's risen. And they still fear the storm. He's awake. Why do you fear? I'm alive. And the entirety of our faith, brothers and sisters, is centered upon, do we believe in that resurrection? That was the center point of the disciples here. He's going to handle the storm. And now, brothers and sisters, I think this valuable lesson is going to be thrown to them. Because in not long a time, those same disciples are going to be thrust into the seas of the Gentiles. And they're going to see big political changes. They're going to see it. They're going to stand in front of counselors and give a testimony and a witness on the man they believe, Jesus of Nazareth. They're going to be persecuted for their beliefs. And you know what, brothers and sisters? Half of these men in that boat are going to be martyred for them. But none of them will perish. Because he's risen. And he's alive in the boat. And he will calm the storm. And these men are going to have to go through the storm of Matthew 8 in the book of Acts. And he's going to be with them all the way. He's going to send his comforter. And who was a man called Comfort? Noah. He's going to be with them, brothers and sisters, and he's going to be that safe haven for the ships. They've got to understand Psalm 107, that Jesus now is the man who's controlling the storms of the nations at his allegiance. And I find it lovely that we're not told in Matthew chapter 8, but the saving of that ship, Matthew 4 tells us saved others, because Mark's gospel tells us that with them were other little ships. If they can believe in Jesus' resurrection, they can save other ships. Well, I think I've got time. It's orange. I'm frightened about what happens when it gets to red, to be honest with you. I'd like us to go to Mark chapter 6, please. Well, this is the second storm, and I think what's being played out here, the first storm is alluding to the ministry of the apostles. This is the journey the apostles are going to go through in the storms of the nations. And I think the second storm here is really about you and I. It's that final multitude. I'd just like to pick up a few little clues. If you look at Mark chapter 6 and verse 7, Jesus now is going to send out the 12. He's going to send out the 12 to preach the good news of the kingdom of God. And how does he send them out? How does he send the 12 out? It's remarkable. He sends them out 2 by 2. Well, there's that taken from? Well, that's taken directly from Genesis 7 verse 9. This is about the ark. This is about the final multitude. This is you and I. And well, Luke chapter 9, they were sent out to the lost sheep of Israel. In Matthew chapter 10, the others were sent out to the Gentiles. And then you come back to Mark and, well, the whole multitude come back. Jews and Gentiles alike, coming 2 by 2 together. Now, what we're not told in this gospel, John's gospel tells us. It's remarkable what happens. Jesus knew every decision. He was 1 or 10 steps ahead. John 6 tells us that when they all came to see him, he says, come unto me and I'll give you rest. That's what he says to them. Come to me and let's rest a while. Well, those are the words said to Noah, right? And then John 6 verse 1 to 2 explains to us that the next thing they did, you know what they did? They crossed over water. And they all followed Jesus over the water as they come to him 2 by 2, as he says to them, I am the man of rest. And then we come to the second storm in verse 48. The second storm, there's another ship, and the disciples now are in that ship. This is the ark, brothers and sisters. This is you and I. This is the multitude. This is the final counting. And John 6 tells us that they're on the Sea of the Gentiles, but it doesn't tell us they're on the Sea of Galilee. It's got another name entirely. Do you know what name it is now? It's known as the Sea of Tiberias. And if it's called the Sea of Tiberias, this sea has Roman origins. They're on the seas of Rome, and they're sailing upon the Roman seas. Those are the seas that we sail upon, not the Gentile seas. It's all Roman. The entire book of Revelation is about the development of Rome. This is what we're seeing here in John 6 verse 1, the Sea of Tiberias. And in this second storm, the unfortunate thing is that Jesus is nowhere to be seen. They can't see him. He's disappeared. But if you look at verse 48, he saw them. He's watching every move. He sees them in the distance, and he's nowhere to be seen from their perspective, but he's looking at them, brothers and sisters, as he's looking at you and I. And what does he see when he looks at them? Toiling in rowing. There's no complaining about being perished. There's no claiming out of no fear. Here, they're just rowing in the storm. This is the ark. And if you look at verse 23 to 25, they've been rowing all night. They're exhausted. It's dark. This is the fight of faith. And they see here Jesus walking upon the waters. And if he's walking upon the waters, then Psalm 8 and 1 Corinthians 15 has been completely fulfilled in this moment. It's a partial prophecy, obviously. It's pointing to the end time. Psalm 8 and 1 Corinthians 15 explain to us that when Jesus is crowned king, all things will be put under his feet. And here he is now walking upon the waters. This is the second advent. Final chapter is Psalm 29. You see, in this storm, it's Jesus who has to come to us for the storms to stop. And what we see in Psalm 29, this is Jesus and the saints and their campaign over the Gentile seas. Notice the language in verse 3. Yahweh is upon, he's above, he's on the waters. And we're given the name of these waters. These are the floods of Noah that we're seeing here. This is the times of the Gentiles that Jesus picks up in Luke 21. This is the whole narrative of Revelation here in Psalm 29. And Yeshua and the saints are now on those waters in their conquering upon them that leads to the establishment of the kingdom that's presented to us in Revelation 4. We're given the name for these waters. It's there in verse 10. He sitteth upon the flood. You know that word flood? That word is unique in the story of Noah. It only appears in the Noahic narrative. The word flood. It's the word Mabul. That's the name. The Hebrew name for the waters of the Gentiles is the name Mabul. And we see it there. It's the floods of the Gentiles. You know, brothers and sisters, if you were to look at Revelation 4 verse 6, when you come to the end of Psalm 29, Revelation 4 verse 6 tells us that the seas are like glass. So when Yahweh sits upon the flood here and is king forever, the seas are as glass like crystal. He's conquered the Mabul, the Gentile nations. You know, my time has gone, brothers and sisters. But I think you'll agree with me. If you were to look at Genesis chapter 6, you'd see prominent figures, three men who caused the corruption on the sins of the sons of God. The one man was called Jabal, the other man was called Jubal, and the third man was called Tubal-Cain. Do you remember those notorious villains? You'll notice that their name, what's significant about the names Jubal, Jabal, and Tubal-Cain? They all have the Hebrew word flood in them. And it was these men who corrupted the sons of God. I find it highly ironic, brothers and sisters, that when divine judgment came, the people of the flood were already on the earth. And it was the Gentiles that corrupted them. And that ethos is here today. And that's why the story of Noah is a story for all generations during these Gentile times. But we will not flounder, we will not drown, because we, brothers and sisters, have a sanctuary. We have an ark. And we wait for the king of the floods and for Israel's restoration.